Gradually, I began to regain awareness of my surroundings, and thoughts began to emerge from the fog in my head. The ominous semi-darkness of my basement workshop, lit only by the light from the half-open door, reflected my mood. One of the rackets I had been working on earlier was still clamped in the vise on the workbench. From the other side of the partition, I could hear our two younger children playing in the playroom and the Disney cartoon they were watching on the VCR. Leaning back in my old, worn-out chair, I glanced at the clock on the wall. I had been sitting there for over half an hour, my mind racing, not moving, not looking, trying to figure out what I didn't want to hear. Sunday dinner was over. My wife, Sally, had cleaned up the kitchen and washed the dishes, and I had gone down to my workshop to restring a few rackets for the upcoming fall racquetball tournament. I had been an avid player for 7 or 8 years, playing several times a week in the mornings until I got a job as an engineer at GM. I also played in at least one evening league every fall, winter, and spring. I was proud that I had achieved good results in a relatively short period of time and always played in the A group. I participated in local tournaments several times a year and usually placed first. Playing racquetball, I consistently maintained a weight of about 200 pounds at 6'2". Our 7-year-old daughter, Jessie, followed me to watch her favorite movie in the game room, followed by 4-year-old Allison. Ellie was at that age where Jessie couldn't go anywhere without her. Fortunately for us, Jessie didn't mind yet. I dreaded the day when she would get older and everything would change. Our son, Jason, now 9, understood well that he was a boy and the oldest, and that he shouldn't play with his younger sisters. He would probably have been in his room building or playing with his model airplanes and cars. Fortunately, Jason took after me and many members of the Robinson clan. He had brown hair, brown eyes, a strong chin, and an expressive but not overly large nose. Jessie inherited Sally's red hair and delicate features. Ellie was blonde, and although she was still young, she seemed to combine features from both of us. I finally finished the grips on the 3 rackets I kept in my sports bag, and as I strung them, I thought some of them needed tightening. Murphy's Law dictated that at least once a week, a string would snap during a league match. I went to check on the girls. They were watching Lady and the Tramp, so I decided to go back upstairs. As I climbed the stairs in my socks and approached the half-open door to the basement, I heard Sally's soft voice talking on the phone. The thought occurred to me that maybe I could sneak up on her and fondle her a little. I thought about setting the mood for something later, even though we had already spent the morning cuddling on the mattress, as we usually did on weekends. Approaching the door, I peeked through the crack to see where she was. Great. I smiled happily. Even after 3 children and 10 years of marriage, Sally was still beautiful. She was about 5'7" tall and weighed less than 130 pounds thanks to regular exercise and a healthy diet. Now she looks even better than when we got married. She was 23 then, and I was only a year older. Perhaps because of the children, our sex life had slowed down over the years, but we usually made time for each other a couple of times a week. Slowly opening the door, I heard a conversation on the phone. Schedule. Tuesday and Thursday from 9 to 3, I heard. There was a pause as she listened to the other person. Yes, I can talk. Phil's in the basement with the girls. Why? Yes, I think so too, Debbie. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. This weekend? I don't think we have anything planned. I think I can make it. Aha, now I understood. She was talking to her friend and boss, Debbie Bradshaw. Apparently, they were arranging another shopping trip, which happened 3 or 4 times a year. I slowly opened the door and took a step to rush toward my cherished goal, but suddenly stopped, puzzled by a strange sound. Sally was giggling. What was that? Then she giggled again, listening to Debbie's words. I was surprised that I didn't remember Sally giggling like that since our honeymoon. Then she lowered her voice and I heard her say, I'd like to try it again before the wart goes away. Suddenly, that phrase reminded me of a conversation I had in a bar a couple of months ago. My head spun. I stepped down onto the basement step and slowly closed the door behind me. Sally continued to laugh and practically whisper into the phone. I could only make out a few words. Last time, I was on the verge. I know. Yes, both of you? Tell him I'll be there. I can't wait. I stood in the darkness of the stairwell while she finished her conversation. Suddenly, I didn't want her to notice me, so I turned around, quietly descended the stairs, and staggered into my workshop. I collapsed into a chair, thinking about the conversation I had overheard. This happened last spring, after one of the last mid-season games at our racquetball club. After the game, we went to a bar for a couple of beers, as we usually did once a month. An hour later, only John Harrison, Craig Davis, and I were left. John and Craig were best friends and had joined Oak Park Y just a couple of years earlier. John loved beer, and Craig only drank non-alcoholic beverages. Over time, I learned that he was an alcoholic and had quit drinking a few years ago. As far as I could tell, the only problem with his alcoholism was that he couldn't recover after a couple of beers, which apparently annoyed his wife a lot. But he still enjoyed the atmosphere at the bar and joined the group whenever he could. Both were married, John had 2 children, and Craig had 1. As usual, after discussing the games, the jokes and conversation turned to women. After spending a dozen or so evenings with these two at the bar, I realized that they had no intention of flirting with each other, and on several occasions they showed an unusual interest in my marriage and my life, to the point where I felt uncomfortable. At least once I left after 1 pint to avoid the subject. That evening, Craig teased John about his wife, Mary. She was insisting that he have a very personal operation. I realized he was talking about a vasectomy and added that Sally was telling me to do it so she could stop taking the pill. But we hadn't come to an agreement yet. Craig continued to grin, while John looked at him with a disappointed expression. "Oh no, she wants him to have a wart removed," Craig said, laughing almost heartily. Looking puzzled, I said, "I don't think I understand. What are you talking about?" John blushed a little, but explained that he had a regular wart there. This time I laughed. I had seen him in the shower, but not close enough to notice the wart. He admitted that the wart had grown over the past couple of years and had started to scare his wife. John insisted that the wart served an important function. His wife, Mary, insisted that he remove it, even if it meant she would lose something. It seemed to me that John objected not so much to his wife losing money, as to her depriving him of an advantage in courting other women. Apparently, his wart was often a topic of conversation and aroused a certain curiosity when he tried to get other women into bed besides his wife. Around this time, I decided that this story had gone too far for me, and I decided to leave. Now I sat in the dark thinking about that conversation. I just couldn't believe that Sally could be involved in what her phone call had hinted at. Sally knew that John and Craig were the guys I played racquetball with. I had told her about them several times, and their names were usually listed on the game schedule I kept in our calendar. But as far as I knew, they had never met. But all the details kept falling into place, no matter how hard I tried to deny it. I felt like I was in the dark, and sweat broke out on my forehead. I just couldn't believe that Sally was capable of such a thing, and I desperately hoped there was some plausible explanation. Whatever was going on, Debbie was clearly involved. Sally's boss, Debbie Bradshaw, had become assistant store manager where Sally worked about 5 years ago. She had been transferred from the company's headquarters in Detroit. She had worked at the same store right out of college and then moved to the big city to get her management degree. Debbie was married to Josh, a financial controller she had met while working in Detroit. Sally told me that Josh was her second husband. Sally and Debbie were about the same age and became friends when Sally was pregnant with Ellie. At the same time, Debbie was pregnant with Shannon, their first and only child. Both girls were born a month apart, which brought Debbie and Sally even closer together. Over the years, we saw Debbie and Josh a few times, usually at events related to Debbie and Sally's work. We weren't in the same social circle and were probably a step below them financially. Debbie was a smart, beautiful blonde with green eyes, but I always felt that she needed to be the center of attention. Josh seemed like a nice enough guy, but I always felt that his main focus was on his work. John and Craig joined the racquetball league about 2 years ago. John owned a construction business and Craig was a managing partner at a home building company. The senior partner was his father-in-law. We were about the same age, married with families, so we had a lot in common. But oddly enough, we only interacted during racquetball or when we stopped in for a couple of beers after the game. Our families never met. As often happens when you start hanging out with new people, it turns out you have mutual friends and acquaintances. One day, when I mentioned the store where Sally worked, John said he had a friend who worked there too. That turned out to be Debbie Bradshaw. Debbie had graduated from the same school as John and Craig, but a year later. According to him, they saw each other a couple of times a year. The shopping trips started about 2 years ago when our youngest daughter Ellie was going through the terrible twos. For several months, Sally had been getting along particularly badly with Ellie. Jessie was in kindergarten, so she also spent half the day at home. Trying to look after 3 children, the house, and work a couple of days a week was exhausting for her. I couldn't help her much, as I was working overtime every week on a project I'd been assigned. It got to the point where one night, after everyone had gone to bed, she collapsed on the sofa and began to cry out of despair and exhaustion. I picked her up and just held her until she finally calmed down. She told me about the situation and complained that if she could just take a break from it all sometimes, she would feel better. I was so upset that I couldn't spend as much time with her as she needed that I offered to take full responsibility for the children on her next day off if she wanted to rest. With tears in her eyes, she thanked me and said she would think about it. A couple of weeks later, Sally said she had talked to Debbie about needing a break from the kids. Debbie suggested they go shopping together and visit some expensive malls in the Detroit suburbs. Debbie was sure her husband wouldn't mind. Although I didn't want to let her go to an expensive mall with a credit card, I agreed. So, on the next free weekend, Sally and Debbie left for Detroit on Saturday morning. On the way, they stopped for breakfast and then drove to one of the malls. After lunch, they checked into a motel, had dinner, and went to the movies. Before they left, I insisted that she call me right after she checked in and give me her phone number and room number, which she did. The next day, they checked out of the hotel, had lunch, went to another mall, and returned home around 5 o'clock in the evening. Sally was so grateful for the trip that as soon as she walked in the door, she hugged and kissed me and talked at length about the shops and restaurants. She didn't go on a crazy shopping spree, but she bought a few nice things for herself and the kids. I was happy for her, and besides, the kids were very nice to me, so I wasn't complaining. That was over 2 years ago. After that weekend, the shopping trips became regular for some reason. Every 3 or 4 months, the two of them would leave on Saturday morning and return late on Sunday evening. It didn't bother me much. I enjoyed spending time alone with the kids, and it seemed to make Sally happy too. I tried to remember if anything had changed since these trips began. I remembered that the second time she came back, her mood was completely different from after the first trip. For some reason, she seemed moody, sad, and maybe a little nervous. I mentioned this to her on Sunday evening and asked what was wrong. She said nothing, just that she had started her period, and I knew she sometimes had heavy flow. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that after the first trip, we hadn't made love on the night she returned or for several days after that, but we had always did it a few days before she left. And when the trips continued, during the week before one of them, Sally was always on the rise, almost in high spirits. I hadn't thought about it before, but now I was curious. Around that time, I heard Sally calling me from the stairs. "Phil, it's time for the girls to take a bath. Can you send them upstairs?" I just sat there trying to collect my thoughts. Phil, can you hear me?" I got up from the chair, walked over to the stairs, and replied angrily, "Yes, I hear you. I'll call them." I entered the family room and, after some arguing, sent the children upstairs. After they had gone up the stairs, I wandered around the room, picking things up and putting them away, mainly to kill time. I needed to collect my thoughts and keep the emotions boiling inside me from erupting. Finally, I couldn't put it off any longer and went back upstairs. When I walked in the door, Sally was leafing through a cookbook in the kitchen. She tilted her head, looked me in the eyes, smiled, and said, "Something wrong, honey? Did you suspect something?" Feeling awkward, I mumbled something about finding a crack in one of my favorite rackets, but I kept looking into her eyes, trying to see anything that might confirm my suspicions. But there was nothing. She was just Sally, the woman I loved. She laughed and kissed me again. "While you were downstairs, Debbie called. She asked if we could go shopping at the end of next week." As she said this, her eyes narrowed, and a veil seemed to fall over them. When I stared at her, she blinked and turned away from me. I knew immediately that she was hiding something, and I thought, how long has this been going on? Desperate, I tried to think of a way to postpone the trip until I could come up with something. Anything. "Don't we have plans for next weekend?" I asked unconvincingly. "Nothing on the calendar," she replied. "I think there's a VFW event on Saturday night. I thought we should go," I said slowly. Sally moved away from me and looked at me appraisingly. "Phil, you know I don't like going to those things. I don't care if Dad goes. All you do is talk about the war and drink. I'm sick of it. So if you want to go, hire a babysitter while I'm gone. Then let's do something with the kids this weekend. Cedar Point is still open for a few more weeks, and we haven't taken Ellie yet. She's old enough to enjoy it," I said, grasping at straws. Sally frowned, and her face turned red. as it did on the rare occasions when she was really angry. We just took the kids to Mackinac Island for Labor Day weekend. That was only a couple of weeks ago. What's gotten into you, Phil? You never used to mind when I went shopping. A little annoyed, I said with a straight face. Never mind, I just thought we could do something together. You and Debbie have a good time. I'll go upstairs and make sure the kids are in bed. I turned and headed up the stairs to the bedrooms. Halfway there, I looked back and saw that Sally was looking at me strangely. For the rest of the evening, I tried to avoid serious conversation with her. As on most work nights, I went to bed before Sally and tried to fall asleep. After a while, I heard her come into the house and go to the bathroom to change into her pajamas. She slipped into bed and snuggled up against me from behind. She hugged me and whispered, "Phil, Phil." I kept breathing evenly and shallowly, pretending to be asleep. Finally, she gave up and crawled away from me. From her breathing, I could tell she had finally fallen asleep. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling, trying to collect my thoughts. I drifted back into the past, thinking about my life and how I had gotten to this point. I grew up less than 20 miles from where we lived now. A typical middle-class family. Mom, dad, me, and my older sister. The most interesting thing about my childhood was my best friend Jason, or Jace, as everyone called him. His family lived at one end of the block and we lived at the other. We met in 4th grade and had been inseparable ever since. If he wasn't at my house, I was at his. Not a week went by without one of us spending at least one night at the other's house. He was Mr. Personality. Always joking, always laughing, rarely taking anything seriously and making friends everywhere he went. I, on the other hand, was quieter and more thoughtful. We complemented each other. As teenagers, we played sports together, started paying attention to girls, and went on dates often. Although neither of us had a serious relationship with one girl, we both lost our virginity a few months before graduating high school. We weren't outstanding students in school, but I usually got better grades than Jace. In high school, I discovered that I enjoyed drawing. By the time I graduated, I had taken all the art classes available and was seriously considering becoming an engineer. After high school, I decided to attend a local community college that had an engineering technology program. The tuition was relatively inexpensive, and the college was close enough that I could live at home and commute. Jace didn't know what he wanted to do, but he enrolled in general education courses. The biggest advantage was that we got a deferment from military service. At the end of my freshman year, I made a big mistake. On Saturday night, Jace and I were at a college party, and on the way home, I was stopped by the police. I failed a breathalyzer test and spent the night in the county jail. The next morning, my parents bailed me out of jail and were furious. I ended up spending all my savings on fines and court costs and lost my driver's license for a year. I spent the rest of the semester riding around the neighborhood on a moped, giving Jace rides. Finally, I decided, to hell with it. Not having a driver's license gave me no incentive to go to school the following year. I decided to take a chance and join the Army. I figured that with my training as a draftee, I could get a job as an engineer and avoid Vietnam. At least that's what the recruiter told me. Of course, he was lying. When I told Jace about my plans, he immediately decided to go with me. The recruiter said we could enlist as friends and be guaranteed to train together. So off we went. Basic training was tough but bearable. Halfway through training, we took a series of aptitude tests to determine what kind of work we were suited for. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, decided that we would be best suited for the green machine as fire control specialists. Our job was to operate what the Army called an FDC computer, but it was actually a complex calculator that calculated distances, azimuths, and the number of explosive charges for artillery shells. After basic training, we were sent to Fort Sill to learn our new specialty. Sill wasn't a very pleasant place, but thanks to Jace, we were able to have a little fun. But that was nothing compared to what awaited us next. A couple of weeks before the end of our training, we received orders to go to Vietnam. After 15 days of leave, visiting family, drinking beer with old friends, and chasing after a couple of ex-girlfriends, we boarded a long flight to I Corps, Republic of Vietnam. After some discussion with personnel officers, we both managed to get into Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 11th Artillery Brigade. It was November 1969, and Nixon had already begun reducing troop numbers as the strategy of transferring the war to the South Vietnamese gained momentum. What a joke that was! For the first 5 or 6 months, we saw almost no combat. We flew a lot of sorties from I-Corps fire support bases, but only participated in a couple of raids. Up to that point, the highlight of our service had been a vacation in Bangkok, Thailand. After spending 15 days in the company of prostitutes and alcohol, Jace and I returned to our unit exhausted, hoping to get some rest. The news that during our absence our unit had been assigned to the 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne Corps did not cause much excitement. But a couple of days later, when our battery was transferred to a deserted hill in the middle of the densest, darkest forest I had seen since arriving in Vietnam, I had a bad feeling. 4 months later, I returned home on a stretcher. Jace returned home in a body bag. I was very depressed both physically and mentally because of the trauma I had suffered. I spent several weeks in the hospital and a couple of months in a rehabilitation center. I also spent some time with a psychiatrist trying to make sense of everything that had happened. After being declared almost fit for duty, I was sent back to Fort Sill to Training Brigade as an assistant instructor. I didn't want to talk to anyone, so I enrolled in courses at a local college and spent all my free time writing papers. After a year there, I applied for early discharge so I could go back to college. As the Vietnam War was ending, the Army was increasing its personnel. I applied and was accepted into an engineering program at a university near my home. The Army approved my request and I was discharged 5 months early, having served 2 years and 7 months. I returned to my parents and applied for veteran benefits. Living at home, I didn't need much. I had saved most of my money while serving in Vietnam. Education benefits and income from part-time jobs covered all my expenses. Looking back, I was a typical, or perhaps stereotypical, shocked and confused Vietnam veteran. The public's reaction to the war and its participants, as well as my injuries, what I saw and did, turned me into a bitter, withdrawn recluse. I let my hair grow long and grew a beard. Most of the time, I wore a hoodie or an old, worn-out army jacket. Jeans and worn-out sneakers completed my outfit. I went to school, to work, and home. I know my mom, dad, and sister Terry were worried about me, but I just didn't feel socially active. I was still seeing a therapist about once a month, but it wasn't helping much. About once a week, I would visit Jace's parents, and we would talk about him and the good times we had together. They seemed to enjoy it, and it was the least I could do for them. One afternoon, I was sitting in the reading room of the International Center on campus. I had a couple of hours between classes a few days a week, and I usually spent that time studying or reading. I tried to ignore the noise around me, but my mind was disturbed by a voice. "May I sit down?" I looked up at the person standing across the table and froze. Long red hair and perfect pale skin that only real redheads can have. Curious brown eyes looked at me, patiently waiting for an answer. I nervously licked my lips, looking at her perfectly shaped red lips and wondering what they would feel like on mine. I was lost in these thoughts when she repeated, "Do you mind if I sit down?" I stumbled and mumbled, "No, sit down." When she put her books aside and pulled up a chair to sit down, I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She was 7 or 8 inches shorter than me, weighed about 20 pounds, and was very well built. For the next half hour, she was absorbed in her books, and I pretended to look at her. From time to time, I glanced at her and admired her appearance. About the 5th or 6th time I looked up, I saw that she was looking at me. She pointed to my field jacket and asked somewhat uncertainly, "Are you a veteran?" I nodded affirmatively and she asked, "Vietnam?" I flinched at the word because the answer to that question is often not very pleasant. But I just said, "Yes," and left the subject alone. A few minutes later, she said cheerfully, "My dad is a veteran. He fought in the Korean War. He was a Marine." I relaxed a little and thought that maybe things weren't so bad. Then she said, "He was even wounded." She said it as if it were nothing. "Civilians," I thought with disgust. But I just nodded and explained to her that I had served in the Army for almost 3 years but didn't mention Vietnam. We started chatting and chatting until she said she had to go to class. She gathered her books, said goodbye, and left the classroom. I was sorry to see her go. She was the first woman I had really talked to since coming home. A couple of days later, I was sitting in almost the same spot when I heard a familiar voice. "Hi, can I sit down?" This time, I responded a little more coherently than the first time. I tried to immerse myself in my book, but she started talking to me like I was her best friend. After a while, she fell silent and, blushing slightly, said, "I just realized I've been talking nonstop and I don't even know your name." A little embarrassed, I held out my hand and said, "I'm Phil Robinson." She laughed and replied, "Sally Baxter, nice to meet you." It turned out that we both had long breaks between classes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Over the next few weeks, we met during almost every break. I heard almost her entire life story about her mom, dad, older sisters, friends, career, and college plans. Not only was she beautiful, she was outgoing, talkative, and independent. Her personality reminded me a lot of Jace. I told her about my family and school, but nothing more. I avoided any questions about the military. To be honest, I preferred to listen to her. She could have read the phone book to me, and I would have listened. I was completely captivated by her. Somehow, she managed to draw me in, to get me interested in something other than school. After the second visit, I started shaving in the morning for the first time in weeks. After the third or fourth time, I even went to the barber shop and started dressing less sloppily. My mom immediately noticed the change in me and started asking questions. I admitted honestly that I had met a girl I liked. She teased me a little, but it was obvious that she was happy for me. A few weeks after we met, I plucked up the courage to ask her out on a date. She seemed happy and agreed right away. Like me, she commuted to class from home. After she agreed to let me pick her up on Friday evening, she said with a laugh, "Keep in mind, my dad is sometimes strict with guys who ask me out. Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Sally, I think that for the privilege of dating you, I can put up with your father for at least a few minutes." Or a lifetime, I thought to myself. She blushed and said, "Oh, you flatter me." I discovered that she blushed easily. On Friday evening, I knocked on her door and a woman with a warm smile opened it. Without letting me say a word, she said, "You must be Phil. We've been waiting for you. Please come in." She took me by the hand and pulled me into the house. As she did so, she looked over her shoulder and called out, "Jack, Sally's friend is here." She turned to me and said in a sweet voice, "Don't worry about Sally's father. He's not as bad as she thinks. By the way, my name is Emily." And she shook the hand she was still holding. I was wondering how to respond when her father appeared from around the corner of the kitchen. He was a big man, about my height, but weighed more than my 80-odd pounds. Not fat, but strong. "I'm Jack," he said in a deep voice, extending his hand and staring intently at me. "Phil Robinson," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Come into the living room, we'll talk while Sally finishes up." The three of us walked through the kitchen into a cozy room with wood paneling, a television in the corner, and a sofa and two soft armchairs around it. One side of the room was taken up by a fireplace with a hearth and a mantelpiece that ran along the entire wall. On one side of the fireplace was a triangular wooden box with a rolled-up American flag. On the other side of the mantelpiece was a wooden box with a glass door, which I had seen in several stores when I was in the Army. Such boxes were usually used to store military memorabilia, insignia, ribbons, and medals. Between them, on a pedestal, stood an M1 Garand rifle. With its polished stock and leather saddle-shaped strap, it looked very impressive. Above the rifle hung a framed Marine flag. It all looked very intimidating. Jack noticed that I was looking at the fireplace and said proudly, "I was a Marine in Korea. I would have stayed, but I was wounded during the breakout from Pusan and then wounded again during the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir. After that, I couldn't pass the medical exam." I nodded and said, "Yes, Sally mentioned that. Tough times." "Sally said you're a Vietnam veteran?" Jack asked when the three of us sat down at the table. "I was there for a while," I replied awkwardly. "What did you do there?" "I was a fire control specialist in an artillery battery, 15555, I said. He nodded in agreement. 1555, those are the workhorses of the artillery. "Where in Vietnam did you serve?" Emily joined the conversation. "Sorry, Jack, he's a military history buff. He knows everything there is to know about the war." "Sure, I understand. My corps only had our battery." Jack looked at me as if he couldn't figure out if I was a real soldier like him or some kind of bastard from the rear. But Marines never thought much of soldiers. "First Corps, huh? That was Marine territory." "Well, by the time I got there, the Marines were almost all gone." Jack snorted. "Yeah, Vietnamization. Great term for take this country. It's yours." "Jack, it's not over yet," Emily said. "Over, except for the screaming. Just wait and see," he insisted, staring at her. I breathed a sigh of relief when Sally walked in at that moment. It was obvious that this conversation could have gone on forever, and the last thing I wanted to talk about was Vietnam. We talked for a few more minutes about school and what we were going to do that evening, then said goodbye and left. That evening, we went out for dinner and a movie. I can't say I remember much as I was completely absorbed in our conversation. At the movie theater, we held hands and sat close together, our heads almost touching. After the movie, neither of us wanted the evening to end, so we went to a bar for a drink. In the end, I walked her to the door a few minutes before she told her parents she was going home. I stood there awkwardly, wanting so badly to touch her, to kiss her, but at the same time afraid of ruining the evening. When she took that thought out of my hands, she stood up, wrapped her arms around my neck and, almost touching my nose, looked into my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Phil, for a wonderful evening." Time stood still as I stared into her deep brown eyes. I swear I could see into her soul. Everything she was and could become was completely open to me. At that moment, I knew I was in love with her. I put my arms around her waist and kissed her gently. From that day on, we hugged like that at least a couple of times a week. She hugged me around the neck, I held her close, and we looked into each other's eyes, hiding nothing. Reluctantly, she pulled away from me and went into the house. The next day, I called her, and we talked on the phone for an hour. We agreed to meet again in the middle of the week, and that's how we became a couple. A few weeks later, when I told her I had booked a motel room for the following Saturday, she blushed, as she often did, but then just smiled and nodded. The evening went just as I had hoped. There were a few awkward moments when she saw the scars left by Vietnam, but I assured her that the doctors had fixed everything and I felt fine. I whispered in her ear, "Sally, I love you. You probably don't want to hear this, but I can't help myself." Sally pulled away and looked at me. Tears glistened in her eyes, and her lips curved into a smile. "I love you too, Phil. I never thought it could be like this. I want to lie here forever." I laughed with relief and kissed the tip of her nose. I don't know about her, but I know I want to do this again and again and again. This time she laughed, then moaned as I entered her, still hard. "God, Phil, everything you want, everything." For the first time since I lost Jace, I felt at peace. That life was getting better. That I had a future with the person I loved and who loved me. When we left the motel early in the morning, exhausted, we knew we wanted to be together for the rest of our lives. That night, we talked about everything. About marriage, about children, about where we wanted to live, about what we wanted to do with our lives. Although Sally was a year younger than me, she was a year ahead in school. She was graduating in the spring, and I was graduating a year later. We decided that after graduation, Sally would go to work and we would wait and get married right after I graduated. In the meantime, I would give up my apartment so we could be together until then. A week later, I brought Sally home to meet my family. My father, Dave, worked as a toolmaker at GM. My mother, Donna, had been working as a part-time teacher's aide since my sister and I started high school. Sally and my parents hit it off right away. Later, my mom said they loved Sally not only for who she was, but also for bringing me out of my shell. And I changed. I was happy. I couldn't stop smiling. I was so happy that when I went back to my therapist, he kicked me out of his office and told me not to come back. Sally's father and I were still wary of each other. I'm sure he was worried about the man who had hit his youngest daughter. And the fact that we were close didn't help matters. The look on his face when we talked about living together before marriage was frightening. Everything changed a few months later when Jack and Emily invited us over for dinner. Jack and I retired to the living room while Sally and her mother stayed in the kitchen cleaning up and talking. After a few minutes of small talk, Jack paused and then said, "Sally told me you have some serious scars from your time in Vietnam. She asked me what caused them." I turned away, feeling uncomfortable. "Yes, but I don't like to talk about it, especially with her." Jack smiled and said, "I understand what you mean. Civilians don't usually like to talk about it." A minute later, he asked, "Phil, when we first met, I got the impression that you hadn't seen what was going on there." I replied reluctantly, "Not really. Not until the last firebase I was at." After a minute's pause, he asked, "Which firebase?" I hesitated again. "Ripcord." Jack's eyes suddenly widened. "Ripcord? You were at Ripcord?" I nodded. "In the summer of '70? He asked with some tension. I nodded again. I was somewhat surprised that he had even heard of Ripcord. The Army had done everything possible to minimize news of that battle because of the large number of casualties we had suffered. That wasn't difficult, since President Nixon was visiting Cambodia at the time. At that moment, Sally and her mother returned to the room, and we began talking about school and Sally's upcoming graduation. Jack and I never spoke about it again, but from that moment on, Jack treated me like the son he never had. After that, everything happened very quickly. Sally graduated with honors. She got a well-paying job as an assistant buyer at a nearby store. She spent as much time with me in my apartment as she could, but her parents decided she should move in with me permanently. I finished school on time and got a job as a draftsman at General Motors before I even graduated. 2 months later, we were married. Since we were both working, we were able to afford a small house on a fairly large lot that could be expanded if necessary. A year later, our son Jason was born. Named after my best friend, he was a real miracle. 2 years later, we had Jesse. By then, we thought that was it. But after some hesitation, 3 years after Jesse, we had Allison. Having a son was special, but it was the girls who wrapped me up with their little fingers. Sally cut back on her work hours and went into retail when Jason was born. She wanted to work at least part-time between children and eventually return to full-time when all the children were in school. At the time, her work week ranged from 12 to 20 hours. This suited her because she was eligible for a large employee discount and children's clothing was expensive. Since I started working, my job has changed constantly. At first, I converted detailed drawings into programs for creating numerically controlled tape for computerized manufacturing. By the time Ellie was born, we were seeing the first computer-aided design systems, and the company selected me for the team that would be trained on the very first version. Life was good. We had plenty of money and could afford 2 cars and a modest but comfortable home. Between the births of our children, we added a bedroom, a bathroom, and a family room. We had 3 beautiful, healthy children. We did a lot together as a family. Every year we went on vacation together, and twice a year, Sally and I sent the children to their grandparents for a long weekend so we could spend some time alone. I always considered our marriage to be strong, and we weren't shy about expressing our love for each other. We hugged often, held hands, and touched each other. I would look at her and at other men's wives and think how lucky I was, and I often told her so. I always thought we were as much in love with each other as we were 10 years ago. Now I wasn't so sure. I felt my life falling apart. I couldn't sleep most of the night and probably only got a couple of hours of sleep. The next morning, I didn't go to class. Instead, I staggered into my office, closed the door, and stared at the wall. I knew I had to come up with a plan of action. I had to find out what was going on. I could ask Sally directly what was happening. As far as I knew, she had never lied to me. But if she was already hiding something, would she tell me the truth now? And how would I know? I knew I had overheard her. I knew what I had seen in her eyes. I started drawing in my notebook and making notes about what to do next, what steps to take to find out what was going on. But when it came to deciding what to do if the worst happened, I was at a loss. I loved Sally. I loved my children. The thought of losing them scared me to death. But even scarier was the thought that maybe Sally didn't really love me. For the next few days, I was a zombie at work and at home. I couldn't think about anything else. Sally didn't even notice until Jay said my father was acting weird. I just chalked it up to being preoccupied with a project at work. On Tuesday, I went back to my usual routine and, as usual, went to play racquetball before work. John was there, and of course Craig was there too. It occurred to me that I had never seen John without Craig, or Craig without John. I realized that if John was involved in something, Craig was involved too. When I walked into the locker room, they were standing at the end of one of the aisles, changing and talking quietly. When they looked up and saw me, John laughed, and Craig started smirking as if he was the only one who understood the joke. Now I realized that smirking was his normal expression. I tensed up and started to get angry. For the first time, I began to see these two as my opponents. John was a couple of inches taller and maybe 20 pounds heavier than me. Craig was a little shorter and stockier. I usually beat them at racquetball, mainly because I played longer and was in better shape. I held back, and the 6 of us played a few games. John and Craig were friendly. We exchanged a few words, then cleaned up and went to work. On Wednesday, I decided to check where John and Craig had been on Saturday. I called John's home from work and spoke to his wife. I told her I was one of his racquetball league members and was calling to see if John could play on Saturday. She replied that as far as she knew, He was leaving for a business conference in Detroit that afternoon and would be back on Sunday. Hearing this, my heart began to race. On instinct, I called Craig's house and got the same answer from his wife. Slowly hanging up that phone, I sat down and stared out the window. It was true. It had to be true. The four of them were sleeping together down there. But the question remained, how far had they gone? It didn't matter, it was too far. I was furious. A voice in my head said, "Do something." On Friday evening after work, I stopped by my parents' house. My dad had retired last year, and they were planning to spend the winter in Florida. In the meantime, they were spending a lot of time renovating the house, getting it ready to sell in case they found something they liked. They also loved to take their grandchildren with them, whenever they could. I told them I needed to talk to them, and we sat down at the kitchen table with cups of cold tea, while I tried to figure out how to tell them. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. I think Sally is cheating on me." As soon as I said it, tears streamed down my face and I almost cried. It was the first time I had ever said out loud what I couldn't even think about before. Mom and Dad recoiled in shock. "No, no, that can't be. Not Sally. Sally wouldn't do that to you. She couldn't do that," Mom whispered. "Son, where did you get that idea?" Dad asked quietly. I told them everything I had overheard and learned. My mother sat there quietly crying, shaking her head. My father came over, pulled her close, and held her tightly. "What do you want from us, Phil?" my father asked. "I need to know for sure. I need to be where they'll be tomorrow night. I know I'm asking a lot, but could you take the kids tomorrow and have them stay with you until Sunday?" I begged. My dad nodded. "Of course, Phil, but I pray to God that this is all a misunderstanding." I nodded. "Yes, I am too. But it's hard to imagine how that could be." Shaking my head, I got up and left. When I got home, Sally was finishing dinner, bouncing up and down on the spot. When I walked into the kitchen, she turned, threw her arms around my neck and kissed me. "The kids are in the rec room. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, she said cheerfully. I could see that her mind was already on the weekend. She was practically flying. It was as if she were on speed or something. As I pondered this, it occurred to me that we hadn't eaten anything since last Saturday. We had skipped our usual midweek date, probably because I had been in a terrible mood all week and had taken sleeping pills a couple of times to get through the night. But Sally didn't bring it up either. I wondered how she would react to the idea. I said hesitantly, "Honey, I just realized we haven't made love since last weekend. And you won't be home this weekend. Maybe you could put the kids to bed early and spend a night together?" Sally took her arms off my neck and took a step back. I saw the curtain fall over her eyes and her smile become forced. "Phil, I'd love to, but my period started a little early today," she said hesitantly. I replied blankly, "Oh yeah, of course, I understand." She raised her hand, stroked my cheek, and said seriously, "As soon as my period is over, I'll explain everything to you, I promise, okay?" I could only hold her close. "Yes, it's a deal," I muttered. She hugged me back and returned to preparing dinner with a smile. I turned and slowly climbed the stairs to change my clothes. While Sally was taking the pills, her periods were as regular as clockwork. Now it was clear to me. She was saving herself for tomorrow's date. If I didn't know what to do before, I knew now. The anger grew stronger and the voice saying, "Do something," grew louder. It wasn't easy to get through dinner without showing my emotions. The kids chatted as usual, and Sally didn't notice anything. Maybe this was the last time we would have dinner as a family? I turned away when the thought brought tears to my eyes. The next day, we stuck to our usual Saturday routine. After breakfast, the older children cleaned their rooms. Ellie pretended to help. When they were done, they were allowed to watch cartoons. I pottered around in the garage until it was time for Sally to leave, then went back into the house. Sally was just coming down the stairs with her suitcase, telling the children to behave while she was gone. Ellie stood right behind her, shouting, "Buy me something, Mommy! Buy me something!" Sally stopped at the bottom of the stairs, dropped her suitcase, picked Ellie up, hugged her, and kissed her. "I will, sweetie. Be a good girl for Daddy." Sally handed Ellie to me, kissed her, and said, "I have to go. I have to pick up Debbie in 20 minutes. I nodded. "Don't forget to call me as soon as you get to the hotel." "Which hotel?" She laughed and replied, "I always do. It's the Red Roof Inn in Rochester Hills. Bye." And she walked out the door. I stood on the porch, holding Allie in my arms, and watched her drive away without looking back. As soon as she was out of sight, I slowly entered the house and called for Jace and Jesse. I had at least 2 hours before Sally would call to let me know she had arrived safely. More than enough time to do what I had to do. They came down the stairs, chatting and asking what I wanted. I told them we were going to spend the night at Grandma and Grandpa's, so they needed to pack a bag with pajamas, a change of clothes, and their favorite toys. After some nagging and no answers to the inevitable questions, I got them to turn around and go back to their rooms. I helped Ellie gather her things and led everyone out of the house to the car. Mom and Dad were waiting at the door when we pulled up. I unloaded all my stuff and went inside. As I headed for the door, Dad gave me a worried look. "Good luck, Phil. I hope you're wrong." I sighed. "I know, Dad. I hope so too. Thanks for doing this. I'll call you in the morning." I drove home via the airport. I stopped at Avis and changed cars. I didn't want anyone to recognize me where I was going. A couple of hours later, I was still suddenly sitting in the kitchen staring at the clock. The events of the week replayed in my head with agonizing slowness. When the phone finally rang after 1 a.m., I stared at it blankly, then snapped out of it and picked up the receiver. "Is that you, Phil?" I heard Sally's voice. Yes, it's me." "You didn't even say hello. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, just great. Are you okay?" I said with a hint of sarcasm. "I don't know what you mean by everything's fine, but we made it." We stopped for lunch on the way. "We're staying in room 168, 5545 645 168. We chatted for a few minutes, and then she said, "Debbie is waving at me. I have to go. We're spending the day at the Meadowbrook Village Mall. See you tomorrow." And she hung up before I could say goodbye. I thought, she didn't even say she loved you. And this morning when she left, she didn't say it either. I dialed the number of the Red Roof Inn I had found earlier and asked to reserve a room. I asked if Sally Robinson had checked in. They said yes, and that they would transfer me to her room. I said no, that wasn't necessary. I would meet her later. I hung up and dialed the number again. This time I asked if John Harrison had checked in. They said yes, but he hadn't registered yet. I said I'd call back later and hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, trying to suppress the anger that threatened to turn into murderous rage. It was a terrible feeling that I hadn't experienced in many years. I got up, walked slowly to the workshop, and opened the door of the gun cabinet. I stood there looking at the old 16-gauge double-barreled shotgun, the 36-inch Winchester Model 73 rifle, and the handle of an old machine gun left over from my childhood. My father had given me his old rifle when he and my mother were preparing to move before he retired last year. I had bought the Winchester when I was still in school and went deer hunting for a couple of years. After Vietnam, I couldn't bear the thought of hunting again. I stood there, lost in thought. I knew that if I took the guns with me, I might never see my children again. I bent down, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out an old, battered shoebox lying in the corner. I took the box upstairs and threw it on the kitchen table. I rummaged through the pile of things until I found what I was looking for. I pulled the K-bar knife I had bought in Bangkok out of its sheath and touched the blade. It was still sharp. Most of the handle was covered in dark rust. I put the knife back in its sheath, bent down, pulled up my pants, tied the knife to my calf, and covered it. I gathered a few things I might need: driving gloves, a bottle of water, a couple of energy bars. It was already 2 o'clock when I got behind the wheel and set off on the 90-mile drive to Rochester Hills. I pulled into the parking lot of the Red Roof Inn and slowly drove along the building until I stopped at room 168. I didn't see Sally's car, so I parked a couple of rows away from the room, turned off the engine, and waited. I didn't want to, but I kept thinking and remembering Sally and the kids. It was already 5 o'clock when a new red pickup truck that I recognized pulled into the parking lot directly across from Sally's room. John and Craig got out of the car. They looked pretty happy, laughing and talking. They took a couple of suitcases and a cooler out of the trunk and went into the room next door. About 45 minutes later, they came out and got into the pickup truck. I followed them for a few miles until they turned into the parking lot of a bar called Tupper's Pub. I stopped outside and watched them go inside. Then I slowly drove around the parking lot and almost immediately spotted Sally's car. I parked on the street so I could see both the front door and John's red pickup truck. I thought about going inside, but the bar looked small, and I was afraid I would be noticed. I sat there listening to old country music and an endless string of songs about how she hurt me. It suited my mood. It was already 9 o'clock when the four of them finally came out of the bar. They were laughing, joking, and holding hands. Instead of following them, I decided to drive ahead of them and go back to the hotel. At that time of night, I didn't think they would go anywhere else. Besides, by parking where I was, I could easily get onto the road before them. I parked in front of their license plate with the windows down about 10 minutes before Sally and her car pulled into the parking lot. The four of them got out of the car and stopped in front of the first room, talking. I was close enough to see them in the light from the door, but far enough away that I couldn't hear what they were saying, except for the occasional burst of laughter. They seemed to be arguing good-naturedly about something. A few minutes later, John took a coin out of his pocket, tossed it in the air, and caught it, then held it out in front of everyone to show which side was up. Some of the onlookers nodded approvingly, and Craig pulled the unresisting Sally toward him and kissed her firmly. Smiling, Debbie grabbed John's hand and pulled him into another room. Holding hands, the two couples laughed as they dispersed to different rooms, waving to each other. I sat there, stunned. Who had humiliated whom? What kind of game was this? As my mind struggled with agonizing thoughts trying to understand what was probably happening in room 168, the voice I had heard all week in the back of my mind began to grow into a scream. Do something, anything, do what? It was obvious this wasn't the first time. They were too good to each other. I couldn't undo what Sally had already done. 10 years. 10 years of marriage and building a family. She had destroyed everything, and me along with it. What was I supposed to do now? I thought I knew the answer to that question. At least I would sleep better knowing I had tried. Then John came out of Debbie's room, wearing only boxer shorts and a t-shirt. He was holding a beer in his hands. I glanced at my watch and suddenly realized that I had been staring at their door for over an hour. John looked around to make sure no one was watching him, then walked over to Sally's room and knocked twice on the door. A couple of minutes later, Craig came out wearing jeans, no shirt, and no shoes. He closed the door behind him. They stood there talking for a few minutes while John drank his beer. Then they said goodbye, and this time John went into Sally's room and Craig went into Debbie's room. Suddenly, I realized what had just happened. I was going crazy. Suddenly, a voice screamed in my head, "Do something, you idiot!" I felt a wave of madness wash over me. I couldn't stop myself. I moved to the other seat, found my driving gloves, and put them on. I deliberately got out of the car and quickly walked up to house number 168. I put my left thumb over the peephole and knocked twice with my right hand. When the door started to open and John said, "What the hell, Craig?" My fist was already flying forward and hit John with all the force I could muster. John's head flew back. He took 2 steps back and fell heavily on his ass. He sat there in his boxer shorts, his eyes closed and his face covered with his hands. I looked around the room, at the overturned bed and the open bathroom door. I could hear the shower running. I pulled up my pants and took the knife out of its sheath. His nose was almost completely on the right side of his face. I tapped his nose with the handle of the knife to get his attention, and when he opened his eyes, I turned the knife around. His eyes widened when he saw the tip of the knife in front of him. "How long, John? How long has this been going on?" I whispered. "Don't lie to me," I said coldly. Maybe 2 years," he stammered, fear evident in his voice and eyes. "Then I suppose joining the same racquetball league wasn't a coincidence, John?" No, he croaked, closing his eyes again in pain. I thought about that for a moment. He wanted to be with the man whose wife he had been entertaining. "You're just a sick bastard, John. Look at me, John. If I hear one more word about you going near Sally or any other married woman, I'll find you. And I'll find your wart. Do you understand me?" "Do you?" I repeated, when he hesitated. "Yes," he finally croaked. "Actually, you'd be better off if you got out of here." John's eyes bulged with terror. Suddenly, a foul odor hit my nose and I realized he had wet himself. At that moment, the noise from the shower stopped and I heard the curtain being pulled back. Sally's voice came from behind the door. "Hey, John, baby. I thought you were coming to take a shower with me. What happened?" And she giggled. I looked up just as the bathroom door opened and Sally appeared in the doorway. She was holding a towel and drying her hair when she suddenly saw me. Her eyes widened. She gasped, and her face turned pale. The towel fell to the floor and she opened her mouth to say something, but every muscle in her body showed complete shock. "John, baby, looks sick," I growled, staring at her. I looked at her menacingly and took a step toward the bathroom. Fear appeared on her face. She took a step back and covered the door with both hands. I heard a click as she closed the door. I turned and walked over to the nightstand next to the bed. Grabbing the phone, I cut the cord with one swift motion and then hid the knife in its sheath. I turned and headed for the front door. At the door, I stopped and looked around the room once more. Suddenly, I screamed in despair and agony, then grabbed the phone and threw it with all my strength straight into the bathroom. It hit the door with a loud bang and fell to the floor, causing a frightened cry from inside. I went out into the street and closed the door behind me. I paused for a moment and realized that the job was not yet done. I went to the other room. Again, I put my left thumb to the peephole and knocked twice with my right. The door opened and Craig laughed and said, "Guys, what's all the noise?" But at that moment, my fist hit him under the chin. I heard a short scream from the bed and looked at Debbie, who was sitting at the headboard with her eyes wide open and a sheet under her chin. I leaned over Craig and checked his pulse. He was alive, but weak as a candle. I stood up and walked over to the nightstand next to the bed. Debbie let go of the sheet and pulled it up to her waist, covering her mouth with her trembling hands, her frightened eyes looking at me through her fingers. I picked up the phone and yanked the cord out of the socket, then I stepped back toward the door and turned to look at her. "If you tell your husband you saw me today, tell him I said hello," I said ironically. Then, changing my mind, I added, "Or maybe I'll tell him myself." I threw the phone into the corner of the room, went out, and closed the door behind me. I stood on the street, looked up at the night sky, and breathed in the cool air deeply. I felt the tension leave me, replaced by a soothing tiredness. The voice telling me to do something was gone. Everything had been done. And I knew what I still had to do. The only thing I could do. With determination, I headed for my car and began to move forward with my life. "Yes," I replied curtly into the phone. The interruption annoyed me, even though I had been waiting for it all morning. I was lost in thoughts of Jason, Jesse, and Ellie. At that moment, they were the most important part of my life. And my top priority was to figure out how to protect them from the consequences of what had happened. "Phil, it's Jack." "Yes, Jack?" I replied without enthusiasm. "What's going on?" "Sally was at the house when Mom and I got back from church. She's crying and says she's afraid to go home." Jack said this firmly, almost shouting. I looked at my watch. It was almost 1 o'clock, almost 14 hours since I had left Rochester Hills. "I don't know what I could have done to make her feel that way," I said. "She says you beat up 2 of Debbie's friends they ran into last night. And you hurt them badly." "Hurt them? They're lucky I didn't kill them," I said sarcastically. "Phil, what the hell? That's not like you." I paused for a moment, wondering how to respond. Finally, I just asked my question. "Did Sally say where the fight took place?" "She said it was near a restaurant in the Rochester Hills area. I mean, she was trying to get away from there. Well, her family, her past." "Sally's your daughter, so maybe it's true," I said slowly. There was silence on the line, and I could tell Jack was trying to make sense of it all. "Phil, I'm taking Sally home. I want to know what's going on. We need to talk." "No problem, I wasn't going anywhere." Jack hung up abruptly, but I heard, "No, Dad, no," in the background. I sighed. She's not going to make this easy for me, I thought. I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at old photos and mementos stored in a shoebox, finishing my second bottle of beer when they pulled up. Jack walked into the kitchen, followed by Sally, who was pulling him by the arm. "Please, Dad, let's talk. Phil and I need to be alone." I looked closely at Sally. She was wearing no makeup, her hair was loose, and her eyes were red and swollen. She was shaking as if she were having a severe nervous breakdown. She didn't respond to my gaze, holding onto her father's arm and trying to pull him toward the door. But Jack didn't move. He sat down at the kitchen table and stared at me. He looked silently at me and at the ka-bar knife lying on the table next to my beer. Finally, he said, "Okay, Phil, what's going on?" I looked at Sally and said mockingly, "Yeah, Sally, tell Daddy what's going on." She turned to me and said sharply, "Shut up, Phil. We can work this out." Her voice authoritative, but her eyes begging me. I was furious that she thought everything could be fixed if we were alone, or that she thought she could manipulate me. I was determined to be as honest as she was, to lie. And she had dragged her parents into it. I looked Jack straight in the eye. It turns out that Sally and her boss Debbie have a few girlfriends they like to hang out with when they go out of town. I found out about it and objected. Quite strongly, I must admit. I said it more tactfully than she deserved. Sally sighed, backed away, and sat down on one of the kitchen chairs. Jack looked at me suspiciously. No, Phil. Sally wouldn't do that. I don't believe you. Jack started to get angry with me and said, "That's enough, Phil. You're being cruel and disrespectful." I looked from Sally to Jack and then back to Sally. I felt anger welling up inside me, overwhelming my feelings of hurt and sadness. Cruel and disrespectful, you say? Not even close, Jack. I'll tell you what's cruel and disrespectful. You should have seen what I saw last night in her hotel room. Traces of another man. I said it without a hint of emotion. Jack quickly turned and looked at Sally. The frightened expression on her face made it obvious that I was telling the truth. Suddenly, Jack collapsed into the chair as if his spine could no longer support him. Jack's face contorted. He covered his face with his hands and whispered, "Oh God." Sally turned pale, her eyes filling with tears. "Please, Dad, don't tell Mom. We can work this out, Phil, can't we? Please, Phil, please," she begged. I sat silently, sorting through old photographs, looking at souvenirs from an old shoebox, remembering a time when I had experienced unbearable pain. After a few minutes, Jack sat up straight and wiped his eyes. He looked at me blankly. "What are you going to do, Phil?" he asked, watching the tears continue to flow down Sally's face. I sat there and thought about that question for a few minutes. Finally, I said slowly, "I never told you or her about Vietnam and Ripcord." I sighed. Damn, I never told anyone about Ripcord. Not even my therapist. I waved my hand at the pile of stuff on the table. Isn't it ironic, Jack, that your generation displays its war trophies for all to see, while my generation hides its memories in a shoebox and shoves it in the bottom drawer? Why is that? I asked rhetorically. I handed him a faded photograph of two tanned, barefoot, skinny young men in baggy jungle fatigues with dog tags around their necks. They were smiling at the camera as if Vietnam was a Boy Scout campout. Had I ever been that young? Now, I definitely felt old. I tossed the photo onto the table between Jack and Sally and began to speak as if I were lecturing strangers. Jason and I were dropped off at Ripcord in May 1971, another base in the chain of bases our battery was assigned to. We air-delivered howitzers, set them up, conducted fire operations for a month or two to support the troops fighting their way through the jungle, and then moved on to another base. We were in Vietnam for 6 months, and we had 6 more months before we were due to go home. But this time it was different. We were stationed on a deserted ridge surrounded by the densest, most impenetrable jungle we had ever seen, overlooking the A Shao Valley near the border with Laos. The valley was a bad place for the American military. In previous years, there had been several bloody battles here with heavy casualties. The Ripcord Fire Base was intended to support 4 battalions of the 101st Airborne Division, fighting in the mountains on both sides of A Shao, trying to prevent the North Vietnamese army from breaking through to the coast along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was ridiculous. The firebase consisted of our battery of 5 guns, another battery of 5 guns, a mortar platoon, and an infantry support company to guard the perimeter. We had 2 helicopter pads and several ash and debris removal units, probably no more than 400 men at a time. Almost the entire firebase was underground, in bunkers, trenches, and tunnels. Later, toward the end of the battle, we learned that we were surrounded by about 12,000 regular North Vietnamese soldiers. I looked sadly at Jack. "Does this remind you of anything, Jack? For example, your Marines at the Chosin Reservoir?" Jack nodded slowly and stared into the doll, as if remembering another time and another place. I paused for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts and memories. The first 6 weeks weren't too bad, at least for us. But for those of us who were dropped in combat formation on the peaks around us, it was hell. We were almost constantly on missions to support them. The helicopters flew from dawn to dusk, but we rarely came under sniper or machine gun fire. The helicopters coming into land, however, were subjected to increasingly intense anti-aircraft fire. On July 1st, everything changed. Shortly after 7 a.m., we came under mortar fire for the first time. During the first week, the North Vietnamese army fired an average of 20 to 30 mortar shells a day at us from 60 and 80 millimeter mortars. Then they started firing 120 millimeter large caliber mortars, large caliber guns that had never before been brought outside the demilitarized zone. The worst part was that because of the wind blowing through the valley and the noise of the helicopters and retreating artillery, most of the time you couldn't hear the artillery approaching. During the first week, I was caught off guard, running from the dining room to the fire control bunker when a mortar explosion knocked me off my feet. I jumped to my feet and made it to the bunker in the blink of an eye. As I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, Jace looked up from the table and said casually, "Damn, Phil, you're bleeding." Of course, in my haste, I ran out of the bunker without my body armor. I never made that mistake again. The shrapnel hit me under my right shoulder. When I got to the infirmary, the surgeon took one look at me and decided to evacuate me to Camp Evans, our supply base, to have the shrapnel removed. An hour later, I was on my way. The shrapnel was removed without any problems, but they decided I had a concussion and kept me under observation for a couple of days. By the time I returned to Ripcord, anyone who appeared above had a more than even chance of being wounded by shrapnel. The days passed and the shelling grew heavier. Not only mortars, but also grenade launchers and recoilless guns. By the end, we were getting 70 to 80 shells a day. We began to suffer more and more casualties. Our guns fired continuously. The muzzles of our howitzers were pointed almost vertically upward as we were firing at very close targets. The batteries used up their main charge in 3 to 4 hours. Heavy Chinook supply helicopters flew in with pallets of ammunition suspended from slings and fired at the Viet Cong with 51 caliber guns. They unhooked without landing and flew away at full speed. Then everyone who wasn't busy with something else rushed to the landing pad and began filling the batteries with shells and boxes of powder charges. During one such operation, I received half a dozen more minor shrapnel wounds. Between constant shelling, performing our usual duties, and delivering ammunition to the guns. When there was nothing else to do, we were constantly exhausted. Artillery planes, F-4 Phantoms, and even B-52s constantly circled around us, striking the hills. Smoke from the shelling hung over the fire base, and sometimes clouds of CS tear gas, which the NVA loved to throw at us, hung in the air. And after July 8th, when we first spotted dinks in the wire, we were on combat alert almost every night. We all knew that it was only a matter of time before the NVA attempted to break through the perimeter. We were all on high alert waiting for it to happen. The shelling continued day after day, and we began to suffer serious losses. Morale was falling, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we had been abandoned. By the end of the operation, we had lost more than 500 men killed and wounded. At least a dozen times I was assigned to carry body bags or stretchers to the helicopter landing pad for evacuation. On July 18th, the worst thing that could have happened. A Chinook helicopter carrying a load of howitzer shells came under fire and crashed. It was right above the 115mm battery and the ammunition supply point. The battery exploded like a Roman candle. The explosions and fires continued for several hours. All 6 guns were destroyed, and dozens of people were wounded. We were all in shock. I looked at Jack, tears streaming down his face. When the Chinook went down, many of us rushed to the battery to help. Several wounded men were burned when the aviation fuel caught fire. Jace and I bent down to lift a machine gunner and put him on a stretcher when the skin on his arm, which I was holding, came off my palm. I shook my head. "I'll never forget the smell of burning flesh," I whispered. Jack nodded at me with a grim expression, and Sally's face reflected the horror he felt. I took a deep breath and continued. We all knew this place couldn't hold, but the higher-ups didn't understand that. All they saw was an opportunity to strike a blow against the enemy. After all, nearly 4 regiments of the North Vietnamese army were concentrated in one place, I said bitterly. A couple of nights later, we were put on combat alert again. We were being fired at from automatic weapons and regular small arms all around the perimeter. Jace and I set up an M60 machine gun in a foxhole in front of the FDC bunker in case of a surprise attack. Our mortar platoon fired rockets continuously to illuminate the wire, and the infantry company returned fire along the edge of the jungle. Every few minutes, artillery ships flew overhead and fired rockets or miniguns at suspicious North Vietnamese positions. Jace and I usually didn't try to return fire because there was an infantry position with 3 men 20 to 30 meters in front of us. Returning fire usually attracted unwanted attention to our location. That night, the infantrymen were almost constantly jumping out of the bushes and firing M79 grenade launchers and automatic weapons. From time to time, tracer shots rang out from the jungle. Then a volley of 20mm mortar shells rained down on the infantry stronghold in front of us. Jace and I pressed ourselves against the bottom of the trench as the ground shook. Stunned, we finally peeked over the edge of our trench and saw that the infantry trench had been completely buried. No one could get out. We quickly took up 60 positions, and Jace began returning fire while I fed him ammunition from my belt. The platoon sergeant crawled over to us, and we told him what had happened to the infantry and that we needed ammunition. He nodded, crouched as low as he could, and rushed toward the tactical operations center. We had already reached the last ammunition pouch when suddenly I heard an M16 fire and felt as if I had been hit with a baseball bat across my back and thighs. I collapsed onto the edge of the trench and stared at Jace. Unable to move, I saw in his eyes the realization of what had happened to him. He moved his lips, trying to say something, but no sound came out. I reached out for his hand, he squeezed it, and then I saw the light go out in his eyes and knew it was over. I looked at Jack and Sally, but they weren't there. Tears streamed down my face. My best friend in the world was dead, my brother in name only. I felt so alone, so lonely, I said in a trembling voice. I wiped my eyes and tried to pull myself together. I heard Sally sniffle. I couldn't tell if it was because of Jace or her own struggles. Finally, I continued. I barely turned my head to look back. About 10 feet in front of the FDC bunker, Corporal Tran was standing there, aiming his M16 at us. Tran was one of Kit Carson's scouts assigned to the 101st. The scouts were mostly North Vietnamese defectors who, for whatever reason, had decided they were on the wrong side. Tran spoke English fairly well and sometimes acted as a translator when the infantry captured or collected documents from dead enemies. He took cover in our bunker a couple of times when we were under fire, and we ate together several times. One night, Jay started teaching him how to play poker, just for fun. Many scouts lost their composure when the situation became tense if they thought they might be captured. They knew that if that happened, they would be shot in the back of the head. A few days earlier, most of them had been locked in one of the bunkers as the siege continued, and their behavior became increasingly suspicious. None of us trusted them. I don't know if Tran was just scared or if he was a North Vietnamese agent. It probably didn't matter. Tran emptied his magazine into Jace and me. I took a couple of bullets in the back, but my body armor saved me from anything worse than a couple of broken ribs and a severe concussion. One bullet hit the back of my thigh, but didn't hit any bone. I felt myself going into shock as I realized that Jace was really dead and I was wounded. I fought against losing consciousness because I knew that if I did, I would most likely die. I began to force myself to get angry, focusing on the enemy and revenge. As my anger grew, my vision turned purple, and I felt murderous rage take hold of my mind. Noticing my movement, Tran tried to shoot me again, but luckily his magazine was empty. I fell down and pretended to be dead. Tran must have decided that I was finished because he dropped his rifle and jumped over our trench. He began waving his flashlight and shouting in Vietnamese into the jungle on the other side of the wire. I got up on my knees to see what he was doing. A rocket-propelled grenade flew out of the bushes, narrowly missing him and me, leaving a distinctive corkscrew trail of smoke behind it, and exploded behind us. He jumped to his feet, waving his flashlight like a madman, almost foaming at the mouth. In the light of the flares, I saw 3 figures in khaki and helmets break away from the edge of the jungle and run toward the wire. As they got closer, I could make out the distinctive explosive bags hanging around their necks and the AK-50 carbines they were holding, indicating that they were sappers. I pulled the M60 lying under Jace toward me. I could barely stand, but I managed to lift it and point it in their direction. I knew I had to stop them before they broke through the wire. I managed to fire 2 long bursts before I ran out of ammunition. I don't know if I hit them, but 3 sappers fell, and Tran turned and stared at me in shock. He was yelling at me, saliva dripping from his mouth, and he grabbed the machete hanging from his belt. Most of the scouts carried them to cut their way through the jungle on patrol. I managed to get my foot on the edge of the trench and push off before Tran lunged at me. I dropped the M60 and managed to pull the knife from its sheath on my belt. We were face to face. Almost unconscious, I found myself on his chest as he tried to push me away and reach the machete. He didn't succeed. I don't know how long I sat there. In the flickering light of the rockets, amid the sound of exploding mortar shells, tracer bullets flying overhead, the roar of howitzers, the smell of gunpowder and burning debris in my nostrils, I felt like I was in hell. Suddenly, Eric, my platoon sergeant, grabbed me by one arm, and Lieutenant Dixon, our FDC officer, grabbed me by the other. Dixon yelled at me to get back to the bunker, that the fast ones were coming to douse our perimeter with napalm, and we were too close to the wire. I paused, took a sip of beer, and ran the tip of my knife over the 3 purple hearts lying on the table. Out of boredom, I arranged them in some random order. Jack and Sully were silent, barely breathing. I couldn't look at either of them. Finally, I continued, At about that time, I lost consciousness. I woke up in a medical bunker on a drip, with the battalion surgeon and one of the medics leaning over me. The doc said I'd probably survive and that I'd be taken out by helicopter as soon as dawn broke. In the end, I was taken out around noon, which was a miracle. Every helicopter that flew in came under heavy fire. Two had already been shot down. The helicopter I was flying in was hit by several shells, including one that killed the crew commander. But that morning, before I left, the decision was made to evacuate Ripcord. I later learned that everyone was taken out on the 21st, and then the place was bombed to the ground. I shrugged. I didn't care anymore. A day later, I was flying to a hospital in Japan. I stayed there for a week. Then I was transferred to Walter Reed Hospital for another month. While I was there, some colonel who had probably never heard of Ripcord was handing out medals. I was given this one for killing enemies. I took a piece of red, white, and blue silk with a silver star out of the box and placed it on the table next to the purple hearts. It was identical to the one in the frame on Jack's mantelpiece. The doctors are treating me well, and they told me that after a couple of months of rehabilitation, I'll be fine. I shook my head, but I wasn't fine, at least not mentally. Every night I had nightmares and woke up screaming. I couldn't get the sounds, the smells, the faces of the dead and wounded out of my head. I missed Jace's funeral, but I managed to get home on leave before heading to Camp Sill. The first thing I did was go to Jace's parents' house. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. They wanted to know everything about Vietnam, what we did there, and how Jace died. But they didn't ask me a single question. Why did you survive? And he didn't. I fell silent and replied quietly. I ask myself that question almost every day. I stared into space, thinking about that dark period of my life. I went to a therapist, but I still felt like I was shutting myself off from the world. I didn't want to see or talk to anyone. At Fort Sill, I did only what was necessary to keep everyone happy. I immersed myself in college drafting classes so I wouldn't have to interact with other guys after work. When it was time to leave the Army, I moved back in with my parents and continued my studies. Not because I was interested, but because I didn't know what else to do. I looked up at Sally, and all the pain, resentment, and suffering of the previous night almost blinded me. And then I met Sally, I whispered. She held back a sob, lowered her eyes to the table, and didn't look at me. You brought me back to the real world. You were happy. You were curious about everything and everyone around you. You were beautiful, both inside and out. Everything I thought I didn't have. And you made me want to get to know you better. You made me want to live again and gave me a glimpse of what my life could be. And I fell in love with you. You saved me. And you gave me 3 wonderful children. For that, I will always be grateful to you, I said wistfully. We sat there for a few minutes without moving. Finally, Jack cleared his throat and asked quietly, What now, Phil? I turned my head wearily and looked at him. Jack, I've been betrayed twice in my life. Both times I lost my best friend, I said simply. Sally buried her face in her hands and began to sob, whispering, No, no, no. The 3 of us sat in silence, Sally sobbing, Jack and I with tears in our eyes. Jack said quietly, Are you sure, Phil? You want to throw it all away because of one mistake? Sally raised her head, a glimmer of desperate hope in her eyes. I knew my words would end our marriage, but I couldn't let the lie remain unsaid. I shook my head and looked at him. One mistake, Jack? It wasn't just one mistake. Last night I found out that Sally had been cheating on me for almost 2 years. And not with just one man. Sally sighed, closed her eyes in despair, shook her head, and sank into the chair even paler than before. I looked at her curiously. John didn't tell you, Sally? He confessed everything? I turned to Jack. Does that answer your question? Jack slowly stood up and looked sadly at Sally. You're my daughter, and I should love you, but I've lost all respect for you. Your behavior... Jack fell silent, unable to find the words, and just shook his head. Sally reached out to touch him, but he pulled away. He turned to me and said firmly, Phil, you don't deserve this. Do what you have to do. But please don't hurt her. I couldn't sit still. No, Jack, I've already been through this, I said sadly. But if it makes you feel better, take it with you. I shoved the knife back into its sheath and handed it to him. Jack took it silently and turned toward the door, his shoulders slumped, no doubt thinking about how to tell Emily. As soon as the door closed behind him, the phone rang, but we didn't even look at it. We just sat there, motionless, not talking, not looking at each other. Finally, the ringing stopped, and the silence became even more deafening. Finally, I said, staring into space, I was expecting the cops to show up at your place this morning, not your father. Sally shuddered and stammered. Debbie and I convinced them to make up a story about being mugged outside a bar. We hoped that if they kept quiet, you wouldn't call their wives. I thought for a moment and realized that I was free. Now they couldn't change their story so that anyone would believe them. For a second, I felt a heavy weight lifted from my shoulders, but then I remembered that everything around me was falling apart. I hummed and asked, "Where are they now?" Sally cleared her throat and fidgeted in her chair. "They're still in the hospital under observation. You hurt them badly. John has a broken nose, cheekbone, and ribs. Craig has a dislocated jaw, several broken teeth, and a concussion." I snapped. "Don't forget their balls, Sally." Sally looked at me with fear and trepidation in her eyes. No, you seriously injured them." She hesitated for a moment. "I didn't. No, you were so violent, Phil. Did you really have to do that?" I looked at her in confusion. "Are you defending those bastards?" I asked sarcastically. Without waiting for her answer, I got up and went to the bathroom. "You better answer, they're probably looking for you," I said. I washed my face and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and swollen. I looked the way I felt, old and worn out, at least older than my years. I spent most of the night awake. I went back to the kitchen. Sally was standing there, staring at the phone in her hand. Slowly, she hung up and sank into one of the kitchen chairs. When I sat down again without looking at me, she asked, "Did you have to? Did you have to tell Debbie's husband?" I shrugged and replied, "Why shouldn't I share his pain? He already called John and Craig's wives, and he kicked Debbie out of the house. Now she'll have to hire a lawyer to see her daughter." She started crying again and muttered, Damn. She looked at me and said through her tears, "And she fired me. She said it was all my fault." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, that's just great. Tell me, Sally, who introduced you to John and Craig?" "It was Debbie, wasn't it?" Between sobs, Sally asked, How did you find out?" "You know, when I told Josh this morning about what you and Debbie did last night, he didn't believe me. He called me a liar and accused me of trying to ruin his marriage. But as soon as I mentioned John Harrison's name, he changed his mind. He turned pale as a sheet and started swearing like a sailor. I don't think he's ever been so angry in his life. You told me years ago that this was Debbie's second marriage and that she wasn't in touch with her parents. It turns out Debbie has a sister who lives up north and whom she hasn't seen in years. About a year ago, Josh was doing an audit at a company, and one of his colleagues turned out to be Sarah, Debbie's sister. Sarah knew that Debbie had remarried, and Josh knew that Debbie had a sister, but they had never met. Anyway, they hit it off, and one evening before finishing the audit, Sarah invited him to dinner with her and her husband Dave. She had a story she wanted to tell. It turned out that her husband Dave was Debbie's first husband. Dave and Debbie started dating in college. They dated for 2 years until Debbie graduated, and then they got married. On their wedding anniversary, Dave found out that Debbie was cheating on him. He also found out that Debbie had been cheating on him throughout their entire relationship. He kicked her out of the house and filed for divorce. Debbie and her parents also fell out over it. Dave and Sarah started dating and eventually got married. They now have 2 children and seem very happy. Of course, Debbie never told Josh about any of this. And guess who Debbie had an affair with during her first marriage? Surprise! It was John Harrison. I stopped, and Sally just stared at me in shock. Oh, and when I mentioned John's name, Josh started putting it all together and realized that Debbie had been doing to him what you had been doing to me throughout our marriage. No wonder he kicked her out. And like Josh, I wonder how long you've been cheating on me, I said firmly. Sally started crying again and said, "My God, Phil, it was just John and Craig, and only during our shopping trips. Please believe me. I never, ever thought about anyone else until Debbie brought it up before our first shopping trip." She sat there, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers, crying and pleading. "Please, Phil, I don't know how I got to this point. It was like I woke up from a dream, or maybe a nightmare, when I opened the bathroom door and saw you there." I didn't say anything, just stared at her grimly. Encouraged, she began to speak quickly, almost mumbling. I knew Debbie loved games like this even before we started shopping together. She talked about it as the greatest pleasure she'd ever experienced in her marriage. But I didn't expect her to get involved with someone else on the trip. I was completely surprised when John showed up at the restaurant and Debbie introduced him to me. She explained that she had known John since high school and that he just happened to live in the neighborhood. I suspected that wasn't true, but I didn't say anything. She fell silent, bit her lip, and turned away. John? John was in great shape that night. He was flirting, dancing with both of us, and paying me lots of compliments. I drank a little more than usual, and when his arms started to weaken a little on the dance floor, I pretended not to notice. Later, when we got back to the hotel, Debbie left with John. He booked a room next to ours. I realized that Debbie had arranged it all. The hotel we were staying at was old, with thin walls. I could hear them doing it all night long. I guess that explains why you were in such a state when you came home on Sunday, huh? I said with disgust. Sally lowered her head and nodded. She wiped her eyes and continued. The next morning, John left. We had breakfast and Debbie told me all about their night. She raved about him the whole way home. Over the next few months, Debbie and I continued to have lunch together at work a couple of times a week, as usual. She often mentioned John and how good she felt with him. That was when I first heard about his wart. Debbie laughed and told me I should try it sometime because she couldn't explain what the secret was. At first, I just laughed at her. But the more she talked about it, the more the idea stuck in my head. A few months later, when another opportunity to go shopping presented itself, Debbie confessed that John really wanted to be with me, and she didn't mind if I went with him. I laughed a little at that, but asked her what she would do if I agreed. She said John had a friend named Craig who would come and keep her company. I didn't say no, and I don't know why. I said I'd think about it, but I didn't think I could do it. Sally looked at me, and I just stared at her blankly. I knew it was wrong, Phil, but I thought I could do it and no one would find out. Sally turned away again and said, on Saturday night, John and Craig came to the restaurant. We had dinner, had a few drinks, and then went to a nightclub. We split into couples, and I was with John. By that time, I had had enough to drink and convinced myself that nothing bad would happen. Everyone was having a great time. Later, when we got to Ostiuam, when we got back to the motel, John and I naturally went to our room, and Debbie and Craig went to theirs. Sally fell silent and just stared at her hands. Finally, I waved her off. So, was it everything you expected? Sally looked at me with tears in her eyes. It was good. No better than it is with you and me. It was so great that it was different, that it was someone new and I could pretend to be someone else. So it wasn't just normal. He turned you on so much that you forgot about your husband waiting for you at home. About your husband who, out of love for you, took care of your children so you could be alone, I said bitterly. Sally held back her sobs and turned away again. Yes, she whispered. How do you explain that to Craig, my husband? I asked ironically. Without looking at me, she replied, after we slept with John a few times, Debbie joked that she was starting to miss him. I didn't think much of it, but on the next trip, when we were paired up again, I danced with Craig almost all night. Later, at the motel, Craig came to my room, and we spent the night together. It didn't seem like a big deal. Then, a couple of trips later, John and Craig switched places in the middle of the night. I didn't notice at first until one night I woke up late and realized that the man making love to me wasn't the man I had gone to bed with. Sally looked at me sadly. I felt like two different people living in two different worlds. I love our life, you, the kids. But I got hooked on these weekends. I thought I could have both and you'd never find out. How stupid of me. Damn, that's stupid, I agreed. And then, when you saw me at the motel, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized what I had become, she whispered almost to herself. I stood up and looked at her. That's an interesting story, Sally. It's a shame it doesn't have a happy ending. But maybe it does, for you. I'll go get the kids. Tonight, after Allie goes to bed, you and I will sit down with Jason and Jesse and tell them that their parents are going to live apart. I think Allie is too young to understand. We won't tell them the truth. And I'll do everything I can to make sure they don't get hurt. I'll sleep on the couch in the basement until I find a place to live. As I started to leave, Sally called after me. Phil, my God, this was a mistake. I love you. Please don't do this. I turned around and said, why not? Sally, unable to hold back her tears, replied, it was only 3 or 4 nights a year. I never saw John, Craig, or anyone else except on those weekends. Please, Phil, I beg you. Can't you forgive me and give me a chance to make it right? Forgive you, Sally? Forgive you for being a whore for other men 3 or 4 nights a year. For giving away the most precious thing you had in the world, yourself. Forgive me for losing my trust in you. Forgive me for destroying my belief that we belong to each other and no one else. I said sadly. And how are you going to fix that? Can you go back in time and start all over again? Can't you not have fun with John this time? And not have fun with Craig? After all, that's what it takes to make things work, I said wearily. I stood silently, looking around the kitchen, at the family photos on the wall, the children's drawings and newspapers on the refrigerator, Allie's high chair in the corner, all the things that made this house a home. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I spent most of last night wondering how I'll feel about you in 6 months, a year, or 5 years. I'm sure I'll be able to forgive you someday, but I won't be able to forget. Not in a year, not in 5, not even in 10. Every time I see you, I'll remember last night. Every time I hear your voice, I'll remember last night. And every time I hear your name, I'll remember last night. I said this with a breaking voice. With tears in my eyes, I said, "This is what I can't live with, Sally." I stood motionless, sadly thinking about the future, barely noticing Sally, who was rocking in her chair, sobbing and crying. "No, please, God, no." After a few minutes, I said, quietly, "Can you answer me one question, Sally?" She looked at me with empty eyes, like a man sentenced to death who knows that his sentence will not be commuted. "You lost the man who loved you more than anything in the world. You lost the respect of your parents, the respect of my parents, and the respect of your husband. You lost your job. And someday you'll have to explain to our children why you destroyed our family. Was it worth it?" After a minute of silence, broken only by Sally's muffled sobs, I turned and slowly walked out of the room. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for updates.